Welcome to my channel.
The mist over Lochdubh didn't so much fall as it did colonize, a damp, grey weight that clung to the heather and turned the mountains into looming, sullen ghosts. It was the kind of morning that suggested the world had given up on the idea of Tuesday and decided to remain in a state of permanent, drizzly limbo. PC Hamish Macbeth, however, found the weather quite satisfactory. It was perfect for poaching. Clad in a tattered barber jacket that had seen better decades, and a pair of wellies that leaked just enough to keep his toes refreshed, Hamish crouched by the banks of the Undubh. At his side, Lugs, a dog of uncertain parentage and even more uncertain temperament, sat with an expression of profound boredom. "Quiet now, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his voice a soft Highland lilt. "If the water bailiff catches us, I'll have to arrest myself, and the paperwork would be a tragedy." With a flick of his wrist that was as practiced as a surgeon's, Hamish landed a fat, silver-sided Atlantic salmon. It was a beautiful to keep him in fish suppers for 3 days, and perhaps a peace offering for Mrs. Kennedy at the post office. He tucked the prize into a burlap sack, his hazel eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a blue uniform that wasn't his own. He was just considering the merits of a second cast when a sound shattered the Highland silence. The aggressive, high-pitched whine of a luxury SUV engine being pushed far too hard on a single-track road. Hamish sighed, the sound of an outsider. He retreated into the gorse just as a gleaming, metallic orange Range Rover vehicle that looked like it belonged in a Dubai showroom rather than a Sutherland bog screeched to a halt near the bridge. Out stepped a man who was, in Hamish's estimation, far too loud for his own clothes. He wore a crisp, mustard-coloured tweed jacket that had clearly never brushed against a real bush, and a pair of sunglasses that cost more than the Lochdubh police station's annual heating budget. "Hello! You there?" "My good man," the newcomer bellowed, squinting at the hillside where Hamish was poorly hidden. Hamish emerged slowly, adopting his most vacant, rustic expression. He allowed his jaw to slacken just a fraction and smoothed down his unruly shock of red hair. "Aye? Is this it? Lochdubh?" The man gestured vaguely at the village below, which consisted of a row of whitewashed cottages huddled together as if for warmth. "I was told it was the jewel of the Highlands. Looks a bit damp, doesn't it?" "It has its moments of moisture, sir," Hamish said, his voice thickening into a deliberate, slow-witted drawl. "I am Julian Van Smythe," the man announced, as if expecting a fanfare. "I've bought the old Macri cottage on the cliff. I intend to turn it into a mindfulness retreat for the discerning urbanite. I'll be needing the locals to cooperate, of course. For a fee." Hamish looked at Smythe. The man was a bore of the highest order, the kind of Sassenach who spoke in bullet points and viewed the Scottish landscape as a backdrop for his own ego. He was the sort of person who would complain about the smell of sheep in the countryside and the lack of artisanal sourdough in the local grocery. "Mindfulness," Hamish repeated, tasting the word like it was a piece of gristly mutton. "Is that like thinking, then?" "We do a fair bit of that here. Mostly about the rain." Van Smythe laughed, a sharp, braying sound that made Lugs growl. "Quaint, absolutely quaint. Tell me, officer, I assume you're the law around here, despite the, fish scales on your sleeve. Is there anywhere one can get a decent espresso? Or is it all instant chicory and powdered milk?" "The Lochdubh Hotel does a fine pot of coffee," Hamish said mildly, ignoring the comment about his sleeve, "though it's best enjoyed with a bit of silence. The locals find it helps the digestion." "Silence. I'll give them something better than silence," Van Smythe declared, leaning against his orange monstrosity. "I'll give them progress. I have already sent a list of demands to the local council regarding the unpleasant smell from the harbour. And that dog should not it be on a lead. Public safety, you know." Hamish felt the familiar, weary prickle behind his eyes. Lochdubh had survived Vikings, the clearances, and the Great Depression, but he was not sure it would survive Julian Van Smythe. "I'll be sure to tell Lugs to watch his step, sir," Hamish said, tipping his hat. "Welcome to the village. I'm sure you'll be making a lasting impression." As the Range Rover roared off, spraying gravel over Hamish's boots, the tall policeman looked down at his dog. "I have a feeling, Lugs," Hamish muttered, "that Mr. Van Smythe is going to find that the Highlands have a very short temper for people who talk louder than the wind." He picked up his sack of poached salmon. He had intended to have a quiet day of mending his nets and perhaps a long nap, but the arrival of the boar felt like a low-pressure system moving in. There was a storm coming, and it usually smelled of more than just rain. Hamish watched the orange speck of the Range Rover vanish into the mist before turning back toward his police station, the weight of the poached salmon swinging rhythmically against his thigh. He felt a small, guilty spark of satisfaction. Men like Vane Smythe were like midges, unpleasant, persistent, and best dealt with by moving into a stiff breeze. He reached his small, whitewashed cottage, which served as both home and headquarters, and quickly set about the business of the morning. The salmon was filleted and stowed in the back of his small refrigerator, hidden behind a jar of wilting pickles, just in case any official eyes decided to wander where they weren't invited. The stove was soon whistling, a comforting sound that promised a pot of thick, dark coffee. Hamish settled into his worn armchair, lugs resting a heavy chin on his boot, and began to contemplate a day of absolute, blissful inactivity. He had a paperback mystery to finish, and a hole in his favorite sock that required a minimum of 3 hours of staring before he could summon the energy to find a needle. But the Highlands have a way of punishing such ambitions of peace. The silence was shattered, not by a phone call which Hamish could have easily ignored by pretending to be out on patrol, but by a frantic, rhythmic thumping on his front door. It wasn't the polite knock of a tourist, asking for directions, it was the desperate pounding of someone who had seen something they couldn't unsee. "Hamish! Hamish Macbeth, come out of there, you lazy great lummox." Hamish sighed, the steam from his coffee mocking him. He recognized the voice. It was Archie McLean, the local handyman whose nerves were notoriously as thin as his hair. With a groan that vibrated in his chest, Hamish opened the door to find Archie vibrating on the step, his face the color of old porridge. "It's the Sassenach," Archie gasped, pointing a trembling finger toward the cliffs where the Macrae cottage stood. "The orange car man. He's gone and done it, Hamish." "Done what?" Archie complained about the tide being too loud. "He's dead, man. Dead as a salted herring. And in a right state, too. You've got to come. I was up there to see about the plumbing he wanted modernized, and I found him in the garden." Hamish felt the familiar, heavy sinking in his gut. A murder in Lochdubh was never just a crime. It was an administrative nightmare that brought the Strathbane crowd down upon them like a plague of locusts. He grabbed his peaked cap, which was slightly askew, and followed Archie up the winding path, lugs trotting along with an air of professional curiosity. The Macrae cottage, once a charmingly dilapidated heap of stone, had been stripped of its character in a matter of days. Scaffolding clung to its sides like skeletal fingers, and a large sign out front announced the Vane Smythe Sanctuary for Soulful Stillness. Hamish found the body in what Vane Smythe had intended to be a Zen rock garden. It was a bizarre, undignified tableau. The newcomer was sprawled face down in a patch of freshly imported white gravel. He was still wearing his mustard tweed jacket, but he was pinned to the earth by a massive, ancient-looking Celtic standing stone that he had apparently been trying to have installed as a centerpiece. The stone hadn't just fallen, it looked as though it had been precisely aimed. Julian Van Smythe's expensive sunglasses lay crushed nearby, and his silk tie was dipped into a puddle of rainwater, looking like a drowned snake. But it wasn't the stone that caught Hamish's eye first. It was the fact that Van Smythe was clutching a sprig of white heather in his hand. Traditional symbol of good luck that seemed particularly ironic given his current predicament. Hamish crouched down, his knees cracking in the silence. He didn't touch anything. He didn't need high-tech gadgets to see that the ground around the stone was churned up in a way that didn't suggest a natural accident. There were marks in the mud, the deep, rectangular impressions of a hydraulic jack that had been used to tip the heavy monolith. "An accident, surely," Archie squeaked, looking away from the body. "The wind, maybe. It catches the light up here." "The wind in Lochdubh is strong, Archie," Hamish said softly, his hazel eyes darting from the body to the perimeter of the garden. "But I've yet to meet a breeze that can operate heavy machinery and then tuck a bit of heather into a dead man's hand." He stood up, looking back down at the village. The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the colourful houses of Lochdubh and the calm waters of the loch. It looked like a postcard of peace, but Hamish knew better. Somewhere in those cosy kitchens or behind those lace curtains, someone was feeling very relieved. And somewhere on the road from Strathbane, DC Far's Blair was likely already screaming into a radio, ready to ruin Hamish's week even further. Hamish pulled a crumpled notebook from his pocket. His day of poaching and coffee was officially dead, buried under several tons of bureaucratic misery and a very heavy Scottish stone. "Aye, Archie," Hamish muttered, watching Lugg sniff suspiciously at a nearby pile of discarded designer floor tiles. "The piece of Lochdubh has been shattered, and I'm the one who's going to have to pick up the pieces. And I haven't even had my breakfast." The sound of the hydraulic jack marks was still fresh in Hamish's mind when the morning air was once again violated, this time by the frantic, two-tone wail of sirens echoing off the surrounding crags. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers from Strathbane screeched up the narrow track, followed by a black sedan that took the corner with a reckless disregard for its suspension. Out of the sedan, Detective Chief Inspector Blair tumbled. He was a man who looked like an overstuffed sausage squeezed into a cheap suit, his face a permanent shade of post-coronary purple. He slammed the car door so hard the window rattled. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice carrying halfway across the loch. "I might have known. A body is barely cold and here you are, standing around looking like a bewildered sheep. Why hasn't this area been cordoned off? Why are you letting this local derelict contaminate my crime scene?" He jabbed a thick, nicotine-stained finger toward Archie McLean, who looked ready to faint. "I was just waiting for the experts to arrive, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic lilt that suggested he was thinking about something very far away, perhaps lunch. "Archie here was the one who found poor Mr. Vainsmythe. He's a bit shaken, you see." "Shaken? I'll give him shaken." Blair stomped over to the body, his heavy boots obliterating the faint impressions of the hydraulic jack that Hamish had been studying. He stared down at the deceased boar with a look of profound annoyance, as if Vansmythe had died specifically to ruin his afternoon golf plans. "Crushed by a rock. Bloody marvellous. It's an accident. The fool didn't know how to handle a bit of Highland granite, and it fell on him. Case closed. Send for the meat wagon." "Begging your pardon, sir," Hamish interjected mildly, "but there's the matter of the heather. And the marks in the mud. It looks as though the stone might have had a bit of help in falling." Blair spun around, his neck disappearing into his collar as his face darkened. "Are you trying to tell me how to do my job, Macbeth? You? A man whose greatest professional achievement this year was finding a lost cat in a drainpipe. I've seen enough accidents in these godforsaken hills to know when a Sassenach has been outwitted by a pebble." "But wait!" Blair's eyes narrowed as they slid back to Archie McLean, who was currently trying to hide behind a stack of slate tiles. "You're a handyman, aren't you, McLean? Good with tools, jacks, levers?" I just do a bit of plumbing and joinery, sir," Archie stammered. "And Vansmythe owed you money, didn't he?" Blair stepped into Archie's personal space, smelling of stale cigarettes and aggression. "I heard he was refusing to pay the locals. Wanted to renegotiate his contracts. You didn't like that, did you? Decided to give the stone a little nudge while he was busy meditating." "No, I wouldn't. I couldn't," Archie wailed. "Right. Take him down to the cars," Blair ordered his subordinates, ignoring Hamish's subtle attempt to clear his throat. "We'll get a confession out of this peasant before the pubs open. As for you, Macbeth, stay out of the way. Go and, I don't know, direct some sheep or something. If I see your ginger head anywhere near this investigation, I'll have you transferred to the traffic division in Glasgow, so fast your boots won't touch the ground." Hamish watched in silence as Archie was bundled into the back of a cruiser, his face a mask of rural simplicity. He knew Archie hadn't the stomach for a fish hooking, let alone a cold-blooded murder. But arguing with Blair was like trying to teach a pig to whistle. It only wasted your time and annoyed the pig. As the sirens faded into the distance, leaving the garden in a heavy, unnatural silence, Hamish looked down at the spot where the hydraulic marks had been. They were gone now, crushed under Blair's clumsy authority. But the killer was still out there, and they had been clever enough to know that the Strathbane police would look for the easiest target. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, reaching down to pat the dog's head, "it seems we're officially off the case, which means it's time we went for a stroll. I believe Mrs. Kennedy at the post office will have heard exactly who Julian Vansmythe was arguing with yesterday, and it'll only cost me a bit of sympathy and a very long cup of tea." He turned his back on the sanctuary for soulful stillness, his mind already sorting through the social hierarchy of Lochdubh. To find the truth, he didn't need a forensic lab, he needed the village's most potent weapon: gossip. Hamish stepped down the winding, gravel-strewn path, leaving the scene of the tragedy behind him. The mist had begun to swirl again, thick and white, smelling of the sea and the dank earth of the peat bogs. It was a deceptive kind of morning, where the silence of the hills seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next calamity. Lugs trotted beside him, occasionally stopping to investigate a particularly interesting tuft of heather with a skeptical sniff. To any casual observer, Hamish Macbeth looked like a man without a care in the world, his long, lanky frame moving with a deceptive laziness that suggested he was headed toward nothing more urgent than a nap. Twined his hazel eyes, the gears were turning with the precision of a Swiss watch. Blair was a fool, but a dangerous one, and if Hamish didn't find the real killer soon, Archie McLean would be facing a life sentence for the crime of being nervous in the presence of a badge. The first stop on any proper Lochdubh investigation was not the scene of the crime or a forensic laboratory, it was the post office. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was a woman who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's business, mostly because she viewed the privacy of the mail as a personal challenge rather than a legal requirement. As Hamish pushed open the door, the bell gave a cheerful tinkle that felt entirely out of place given the morning's events. The air inside smelled of old paper, peppermint humbugs, and the faint, underlying scent of Mrs. Kennedy's lavender perfume. "It's a terrible thing, Hamish," Mrs. Kennedy began before he could even close the door. She was already leaning over the counter, her eyes bright with the fever of high-quality gossip. "A terrible, terrible thing. Crushed by a stone, they say it was the wrath of the ancients. Though I suspect it was just poor engineering, and they've taken poor Archie. It's a disgrace, so it is." "Aye, it's a bit of a mess, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said, leaning his elbows on the counter in a way that suggested he had all the time in the world. "I don't suppose you've got a spare digestive biscuit? I seem to have forgotten my breakfast in all the excitement. You'll fade away to nothing, Hamish Macbeth," she clucked, reaching into a tin beneath the counter. She produced 2 biscuits and a mug of tea that had been steeping to the colour of mahogany. True that Blair shouted at you until his face turned the colour of a ripe plum. "It was more of a magenta, actually," Hamish replied, taking a long, appreciative sip of the tea. "But tell me about Mr. Van Smythe. He seemed a man who liked to make a stir. Did he have much correspondence?" Mrs. Kennedy's expression shifted from sympathy to a sharp, predatory alertness. "Correspondence? The man was a menace with a pen, Hamish. He wasn't just building a retreat, he was sending out letters to half the village. Not nice letters either. He was looking into the old land deeds. He told Major Higgins that his driveway actually belonged to the McRae cottage, and he threatened to put up a gate. And he was writing to the council about the minister's noise pollution, the church bells. Can you believe it? But there was one letter, Hamish. One he didn't send through the post, but I saw him handing it over outside the hotel. A thick, heavy envelope, given to a man in a dark car. Not a local car, mind you." "A dark car?" Hamish prompted, his ears pricking up. "Aye, a black sedan with tinted windows." He looked scared. Hamish, for all his bluster, Van Smythe looked like a man who was being chased by his own shadow. Hamish finished his tea and thanked her, his mind already drifting toward his next port of call. He walked down the main street to the Lochdubh curry house. Mr. Patel, the owner, was usually found polishing his front window with a fervour that suggested he was trying to see through time itself. As Hamish approached, Patel stepped outside, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "The bore is gone, P.C. Macbeth," Patel said, crossing his arms. "The universe has a way of balancing the books, does it not? Hey, the man came in here last week and told me my korma was unauthentic. Me, a man who has been grinding his own spices since before he could walk. He had a gift for making friends, it seems," Hamish said. "Did you see anything unusual last night, Mr. Patel?" "You have a clear view of the road up to the cliff." Patel lowered his voice. "I saw a man, Hamish, late. Around 11. He wasn't in a car, he was walking. He had a limp, a heavy one, and he was carrying something long and metal. I thought it was a fishing rod, but now I think it might have been something else, something to lift a weight. A limp," Hamish mused. He knew everyone in the village, and no one of Archie's build had a limp, but he remembered a disgruntled former employee of Van Smythe's, a man who had been fired from the London office and had followed him north to demand his severance. Or perhaps it was someone closer to home, someone hiding behind a respectable veneer. "And another thing," Patel added, leaning closer. "Van Smythe was not a rich man, Hamish. I heard him on his mobile phone outside. He was begging someone for more time. He said the retreat was his last chance to pay back the investors. He was a fraud, P.C. Macbeth, a man built of straw and mustard tweed." Hamish nodded, the pieces beginning to click together in a way that had nothing to do with Archie McLean's plumbing tools. Van Smythe had not been an arrogant millionaire. He had been a desperate man playing a dangerous game of bluff with people who did not take kindly to losing money. The mindfulness retreat was not a sanctuary. It was a money laundering scheme that had run dry. As Hamish walked back toward his station, the undercurrent of darkness in the village felt colder than the wind. She knew Blair was currently bullying a confession out of Archie. But the real killer was someone who knew exactly how to use a hydraulic jack and exactly how to disappear into the Highland mist. He needed to talk to Priscilla. She would know the social history of the investors Van Smythe had been so afraid of. But first, He had to dodge another call from headquarters. The light was fading, and the shadows of Lochdubh were growing long, hiding secrets that a lazy policeman was just beginning to unearth. Hamish took the long way back, his boots splashing through the puddles that had gathered in the ruts of the road. The scent of wood smoke began to drift from the chimneys, a sign that the village was settling in for the evening, blissfully unaware of the complexities of the web Hamish was untangling. He thought about the man with the limp. There was a certain weight to that piece of information, a physical reality that grounded the case. In the Highlands, a limp was a mark of history's fall on the crags, a mishap with a tractor, or an old war wound. It wasn't something that could be easily hidden, not in a place where everyone's gait was as recognizable as their face. He paused by the harbour, watching the fishing boats bobbing on the slate-grey water. The rhythm of the village was slow, but underneath that slowness was a fierce protectiveness. If Van Smythe had been threatening the village with his legal notices and land disputes, he had poked a hornet's nest. But the fraud, the desperate financial struggle that suggested an outside influence, a darkness brought from the city and planted in the thin soil of the north. Hamish knew that Blair would never look for a financial motive beyond a simple "he owed me money." Blair wanted a villain he could shout at, someone he could break in an interrogation room. He wouldn't understand the quiet, desperate terror of a man whose house of cards was falling down. Hamish reached his door and saw a flash of blonde hair in the distance. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the girl who always seemed to be just out of his reach and yet always at the center of his thoughts during a crisis. She was walking her own dog, her stride confident and elegant, a sharp contrast to his own shambling walk. He felt a familiar twinge of inadequacy, but he pushed it aside. He had work to do. He had to prove that the boar had been silenced, not by a local's temper, but by a professional's necessity. The white heather in the dead man's hand was not just a sign of luck, it was a message. A very specific, very Scottish message of farewell that suggested the killer had a sense of dark irony. He stepped inside, lugs following close behind, and looked at the cold stove. He needed another pot of coffee. The night was going to be long, and the investigation was only just beginning to show its true, ugly face. He sat at his kitchen table, pulling out a scrap of paper to jot down the names of the people Van Smythe had been feuding with. The list was long, but only a few had the coldness of heart to wait in the rain with a hydraulic jack. As the clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, Hamish Macbeth let the mask of the lazy policeman slip, replaced by the sharp, focused mind of a man who knew his neighbours better than they knew themselves. The silence of the cottage was absolute, save for the ticking clock and the heavy breathing of lugs. Hamish began to map out the movements of the mysterious black sedan. If Van Smythe had been meeting someone in secret, it meant the mindfulness retreat was nothing more than a front, a stage set for a much larger drama. He thought of the thick envelope. Money, documents, or perhaps evidence of the very fraud that was destroying him. The Sassenach had brought more than just his arrogance to Lochdubh. He had brought a contagion of greed and fear. Hamish stood up and went to the window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the mountains. Somewhere out there, the man with the limp was watching, or perhaps he was already gone, melting back into the world of cities and glass towers. But Hamish didn't think so. There was a local flavour to the murder, a familiarity with the terrain that suggested someone who knew the cliffs of the Macrae cottage as well as they knew their own garden. He needed to find the connection between the urban fraud and the rural execution. He needed to know why Julian Van Smythe, a man who loved the sound of his own voice, had been forced to stop talking forever. The knock at the door was not the frantic drumming of Archie MacLean, but a light, rhythmic tapping that suggested a person who was accustomed to being welcomed rather than tolerated. Hamish, who had been staring morosely at a cold, soot-stained kettle, smoothed down his unruly red hair and adjusted his tie, which had a tendency to migrate toward his left ear whenever he was deep in thought. He opened the door to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe standing on the step. She was dressed in an expensive-looking waxed jacket and silk scarf, looking every bit the daughter of the local gentry. The damp Highland air seemed to respect her enough not to ruin her hair, a privilege it never extended to Hamish. Behind her, the village of Lochdubh was sinking into a deep, bruised purple as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, leaving only the silver glimmer of the loch to catch the remaining light. "I heard about the trouble at the Macrae cottage, Hamish," she said, her voice a cool, clear bell in the quiet evening. "The village is talking of nothing else. They say DCY Blair has already arrested poor Archie and is currently trying to make him confess to being a secret agent for the IRA, or something equally ridiculous. I thought I should come and see if you were actually doing anything, or if you were just sitting here, waiting for the salmon to cook itself." Hamish stepped back, gesturing for her to enter the small, cramped warmth of the station. I've had a busy day, Priscilla, though you wouldn't know it to look at me. Blair is convinced it's a local matter, but there's a smell about this one that doesn't belong to Lochdubh. It smells of expensive leather and desperate bank accounts. Would you like a cup of tea? The coffee is a bit of a project at the moment. Priscilla sat on the edge of his scarred wooden chair, looking around the room with an expression of mild pity. No tea, thank you. My father had Julian Vansmythe over for dinner last week. He was trying to persuade the Colonel to invest in that sanctuary of his. It was a ghastly evening, Hamish. The man didn't stop talking for 3 hours. He was a bore in the most professional sense of the word. He spoke about synergy and wellness, as if he had invented them, but he couldn't even distinguish a single malt from a blended whiskey. My father was unimpressed, to say the least. Hamish leaned against the mantelpiece, his hazel eyes narrowing. And did he mention where his money was coming from? Mr. Tell at the curry shop seems to think the man was as broke as a winter's peat bog. Priscilla nodded, her expression turning serious. That's why I'm here. During dinner, Julian's phone rang. He went into the hallway to take it, but the walls at the big house are not as thick as he thought. I heard him arguing. He called the person Arthur and said that the Strathbane interest would be paid by the end of the month. He sounded terrified. Hamish. Not the usual arrogance at all. He mentioned a man named Arthur Greaves. Does that name mean anything to you? Hamish felt a cold prickle of recognition. Arthur Greaves was a name that surfaced occasionally in the Strathbane police reports, a man with fingers in many pies, most of them involving high-interest loans and very low-tolerance collection methods. Greaves is a shadow, Priscilla. He doesn't come to places like Lochdubh unless there's a very large debt to be collected. Did Vansmythe have any guests at the house? A man with a limp, perhaps? Priscilla paused, her brow furrowing in thought. Actually, yes. On Saturday, a black car dropped someone off at the foot of the cliff path. I was out riding. The man who got out was older, wearing a very heavy coat, and he walked with a pronounced hitch in his gait. He didn't look like a mindfulness seeker. He looked like someone who had spent his life in the back rooms of betting shops. Julian met him halfway, and they looked as though they were having a very intense disagreement. A hitch in his gait, Hamish muttered. The image of the man Mr. Patel had seen suddenly coming into sharp focus. And Blair is down at the station trying to pin a murder on a man who can't even kill a spider without apologizing to it. Treves is involved. Then Vansmythe was not killed because he was a bore. He was killed because he was a liability. But the heather, Priscilla, why the white heather in his hand? It's a bit of a flourish for a city debt collector. Priscilla stood up, smoothed her jacket, and walked to the window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the hills. Perhaps it wasn't the collector who put it there. Perhaps it was someone who wanted it to look like a Highland feud, or perhaps Julian clutched it himself, a last-ditch effort at a lucky charm. He was a very superstitious man, Hamish. He told me he wouldn't start the renovations until the moon was in the right phase. It was all part of his spiritual persona. Hamish looked at her, noting the way the lamplight caught the gold in her hair. She was always the smartest person in the room, even when she wasn't trying to be. She had provided the missing link, the bridge between the arrogant Sassenach outsider and the dark, grimy reality of the Scottish underworld. Julian Vansmythe had been a man playing a role, a fraud who had accidentally stepped onto a stage where the stakes were life and death. Thank you, Priscilla, Hamish said softly. You've given me more to go on than a dozen forensic labs. Blair will never look at Arthur Greaves. He wants a simple villain he can parade in front of the press. If I'm going to save Archie, I'm going to have to find that man with the limp before he decides to leave the Highlands for good. Be careful, Hamish, Priscilla said, her hand resting briefly on his arm as she moved toward the door. Men like that don't care about the jewel of the Highlands. They only care about the bottom line, and if you get in their way, you might find yourself under a stone too. She slipped out into the night. Hamish stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her taillights disappear into the mist. He felt a sudden, sharp hunger, but it wasn't for food. It was for justice. He knew that the next few hours would be critical. He needed to find out where that black sedan was being kept, and why a London fraudster was being visited by a Strathbane enforcer in the middle of a Highland storm. He whistled for Lugs, who woke with a start and a disgruntled woof. Come on, Lugs, Hamish said, reaching for his heavy waterproof cape. We've got a bit of mooching to do, and this time, it's not for scones. We're going to find out what Julian Vansmythe was really hiding in that sanctuary of his, and why someone decided that the only way to find peace was to ensure he never spoke again. The air outside was freezing now, a harbinger of the snow that often arrived late in the season to catch the unwary by surprise. Hamish Macbeth, the lazy policeman of Lochdubh, began to walk with a purpose that would have shocked DC First Blair. He moved through the shadows of the village, a ghost in a blue uniform, heading toward the one place where a man with a limp might find a place to hide: the old abandoned cannery by the harbour. The abandoned cannery was a dark, brooding presence at the edge of the harbour, its rusted corrugated iron sheets groaning under the lash of a rising wind. Hamish Macbeth paused in the shadows, his tall, lanky frame nearly invisible against the weathered stone of the pier. He watched the black surface of the water, which slapped rhythmically against the barnacle-encrusted pilings, but his mind was not on the scenery. He was thinking of the man with the limp and the black sedan that Priscilla had described. However, before he could step toward the gaping mouth of the cannery's entrance, a sudden flare of blue light cut through the mist from the direction of the village square. It was the frantic, spinning strobe of a police cruiser, parked squarely in front of his own small station. The sirens were silent, but the visual urgency was unmistakable. DC Fars Blair was back, and he wasn't there for a social call. Hamish felt a familiar, heavy tug of dread in his chest. He knew that if he didn't intervene now, Archie McLean would be processed, charged, and lost to the gears of a Strathbane legal machine that favoured speed over accuracy. He turned away from the harbour, whistling softly for Lugs. The dog, sensing the shift in his master's mood, abandoned his investigation of a discarded crab shell and fell into step. They walked back through the narrow, twisting streets of Lochdubh, where the windows of the cottages were now glowing with a warm, amber light that spoke of stew and safety luxuries Hamish knew he would not be enjoying tonight. As he approached the station, the scene was one of orchestrated chaos. Two uniformed officers from Strathbane were hauling a weeping Archie McLean toward the back of a van, while DC Wars Blair stood on the doorstep, his chest puffed out like a territorial pigeon. He held a heavy, grease-stained hydraulic jack in his gloved hand, as if it were the crown jewels. "There he is," Blair bellowed, as Hamish stepped into the light. "The village idiot returns from his evening stroll. While you were out counting sheep, Macbeth, my team has been doing actual police work. We found the murder weapon hidden under a pile of sawdust in McLean's workshop, a hydraulic jack, perfectly capable of tipping that stone, and we have a witness." Miss Eyes Gowdy from the hill cottage saw this pathetic specimen and his mangy collie, Bess, heading up toward the Macrae Cliffs at exactly 11 o'clock last night. "It's an open and shut case. I'll have him in the cells before the midnight news." Hamish stopped, his face remaining a mask of rural vacuity. He looked at Archie, whose eyes were red-rimmed and bulging with terror. "Is that right, Archie?" Hamish asked softly, his Highland drawl thickening. "Were you out for a midnight walk with Bess?" I didn't kill him, Hamish," Archie wailed, his voice cracking. "I was home. I swear it on my mother's grave." Blair let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Of course he says that. But Mrs. Gowdy is a respectable woman. She saw him. She saw the dog. She saw the jack. What more do you want, Macbeth? DNA from a rock." Hamish stepped closer to the hydraulic jack Blair was brandishing. He didn't touch it, but his eyes swept over the rusted metal and the clotted grease around the handle. Then he looked at the ground, then back at Blair. "It's a fine jack, sir," Hamish said mildly. "A very sturdy piece of equipment, but there's a small problem with Mrs. Gowdy's story. A very small one, to be sure, and perhaps a big city detective like yourself wouldn't notice the trifles of village life." Blair's face began its predictable transition from pink to a dangerous, mottled violet. "Trifles. A witness seeing the killer at the scene is a trifle. I've had enough of your insolence, Macbeth. Move aside. It's just about the dog, you see," Hamish continued, his voice as calm as the loch on a summer day. "Mrs. Gowdy says she saw Archie and Bess, but Bess isn't in Lochdubh. Archie's dog has been at the veterinary clinic in Strathbane since yesterday morning. She had a run-in with a tractor and needed surgery on her hip. Archie asked me for a lift, but I was, busy with police business, so he had to take the bus. The dog is currently in a kennel 10 miles away, probably sedated up to her ears." The silence that followed was so absolute that the sound of the wind through the telephone wires seemed like a roar. Blair's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The uniformed officers paused, their grip on Archie's arms loosening just a fraction. "You're lying," Blair finally hissed, though the conviction had drained from his voice. "You're covering for him. You're all in it together in this stinking little heap of a village." "You can call the vet yourself, sir," Hamish said, reaching into his pocket for a crumpled piece of paper. "I believe I have the number here." Archie was very worried about the bill. He's been home all night, moping about his dog and drinking far too much of that cheap sherry he buys from the grocery. If Mrs. Gowdy saw a man with a dog on the cliff, she didn't see Archie. And if she saw a dog, it wasn't a collie with a broken hip. Hamish leaned in a little closer, his expression one of helpful concern. And that jack, sir, if you look at the base, you'll see it's covered in red clay. The kind they have down by the old brickworks, but the Macri cottage is built on peat and white gravel, not a speck of red clay for 3 miles in any direction. I suspect someone put that jack in Archie's shed quite recently, perhaps tonight, while he was busy being arrested by your fine officers. Claire looked down at the jack, his eyes flickering with the realization that his career-making arrest was dissolving into a puddle of embarrassment. He shoved the jack into the hands of a subordinate and turned on Hamish, his teeth bared in a snarl. This changes nothing. So the witness was mistaken about the dog. It was dark. It was misty. It don't prove he didn't do it. It proves your witness is unreliable, sir, Hamish said, his tone remaining infuriatingly polite. And without the witness or the jack, all you have is a man who's very sad about his dog. It wouldn't look good in the papers. DC Vice Blair. Innocent handyman arrested while dogfights for life. The tabloids would have a field day with the Strathbane police's lack of compassion. Blair let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a growl and a sob. He gestured wildly at the officers. Let him go! But don't you think you've won, Macbeth? I'll be watching you. I'll be watching this whole village. If I find out you've tampered with evidence, I'll have your badge and your cottage. He stormed toward his car, the gravel crunching under his heels, like the bones of his pride. As the cruisers roared away, leaving a dazed Archie McLean standing on the pavement, Hamish felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He had bought Archie some time, but he had also cleared the stage for the real killer. The man with the limp was still out there, and he was cleverer than Blair could ever imagine. He had used the village's own gossip and Archie's reputation to create a perfect smokescreen. Hamish looked toward the dark silhouette of the cannery. The trap was set, but it wasn't Archie who was caught in it. Julian Vansmythe's past, and it was finally coming home to roost in the Highlands. Go home, Archie, Hamish said, patting the man on the shoulder. And for heaven's sake, lock your shed. I have a feeling the next visitor won't be carrying a badge. Hamish turned back toward the harbour, lugs at his side. He knew now that the crime wasn't about a local grudge or a boring Sassenach. It was about something much older and much more dangerous. He needed to find the man with the limp before the mist swallowed the truth forever. The white heather in Vansmythe's hand was no longer a mystery, it was a taunt. And Hamish Macbeth, the man everyone thought was too lazy to notice the world, was finally ready to answer the challenge. The game was no longer about tea and biscuits, it was about survival. The wind at the harbour was a different beast than the wind on the cliffs. Here, it carried the sharp, briny tang of rotting seaweed and the cold promise of the North Atlantic. Hamish Macbeth stood by the rusted gates of the old cannery, his hands deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the dark, oily water. Lugg sat at his side, shivering slightly, and looking up at his master with an expression that clearly suggested a warm hearth and a bowl of scraps would be a far superior use of their time. Hamish ignored the silent plea. His mind was back in the post office, then at the hotel, and finally in the mud of the Zen garden. He was replaying every word Julian Vansmythe had uttered during their brief, unpleasant encounter on the road. The man had been a bore, yes, a loud, mustard tweed wearing nuisance, but he had also been a man playing a very specific part. Arrogance had been too polished, the Sassenach accent a little too brittle around the edges, like a cheap coat of paint over old weathered wood. Hamish had seen many outsiders come to Lochdubh, but Vansmythe didn't smell like London money. He smelled like a man who had spent his life trying to forget where he came from. The realization began as a small, cold itch at the back of Hamish's neck. He started walking away from the harbour, heading toward the small, neglected cemetery that sat on the rise behind the village church. The Arthur Greaves debt was a real enough threat, and the black sedan certainly belonged to a world of violence, but the murder itself, the crushing stone, the hydraulic jack, and the sprig of white heather wasn't the work of a city enforcer. A debt collector from Strathbane would have used a lead pipe or a heavy boot. They wouldn't have bothered with the theatricality of a standing stone. They certainly wouldn't have tucked a symbol of Highland luck into the victim's cooling fingers. That was a local touch. It was an act of poetic justice, a Highland execution for a Highland sin. As Hamish reached the cemetery gates, he pulled a small torch from his pocket, its beam cutting a weak, yellow path through the gathering dark. He navigated the leaning headstones until he found what he was looking for, a modest, moss-covered slab near the back wall. The name on the stone was Mary McCrae. She had died 20 years ago, barely 21. Beside her name was a small, carved sprig of white heather. Hamish remembered the story now, buried deep under years of village gossip and more recent tragedies. Mary had been a local beauty, the daughter of the man who had once lived in the very cottage Julian Van Smythe had been modernizing. She had fallen for a boy from the next glen, a charming, fast-talking lad with big ambitions and a silver tongue. He had promised to take her away to the city, but instead, he had vanished one night, taking her father's life savings with him. Mary had withered away, her heart broken, and her reputation in tatters, eventually taking her own life in the cold waters of the Loch. The boy's name had been Jimmy Smith. He had never been heard from again, and the McCrae family had slowly faded into obscurity, their cottage falling into the ruin that Van Smythe had recently purchased. Hamish leaned against a gnarled rowan tree, the pieces falling into place with a sickening thud. Julian Van Smythe hadn't just bought the McCrae cottage by chance. He was Jimmy Smith, returning to the scene of his first great swindle. He had changed his name, refined his accent, and built a career out of mindfulness and fraud. But he had run out of luck in the city. He had come back to Lochdubh, thinking that 20 years was long enough for the village to forget his face. He had intended to use the old cottage to launch one last scam, perhaps even digging up the savings he had hidden all those years ago. But he had forgotten one thing. The Highlands have a memory like granite. People here don't forget a face, especially not one that caused so much grief. And while Blair was looking for a modern motive of debt and finance, Hamish was looking at a motive as old as the hills: revenge. The question now was who was left to take it. Mary McCrae had no brothers, and her father had died shortly after her. But there had been a cousin, a quiet, invisible boy, who had worked as a labourer at the brickworks before moving into the village to take up odd jobs. Hamish thought back to the mooching he had done earlier. He recalled the man who had been serving tea at the hotel, the one who always seemed to be in the background, polishing glasses or carrying luggage. He was a man who moved with a slight hitch in his gait, a limp from an old accident with a tractor. He was the man who had been helpful by suggesting that Archie McLean might have the tools needed for the heavy lifting at the cottage. His name was Peter, the hotel porter. He had been there when Van Smythe arrived, standing in the shadows of the lobby, watching the man who had destroyed his family come back to gloat. The red clay on the jack now made perfect sense. Peter lived in a small, damp flat near the old brickworks. He would have kept his tools there, in a place no one bothered to visit. He had waited for the right moment, perhaps seeing Van Smythe out in his garden, admiring his Zen creation. Peter wouldn't have needed high-tech forensics. He knew the weight of the stones and the tilt of the land. He had used the very arrogance of the man against him, waiting until the bore was positioned perfectly before tipping the scales of justice. The white heather was not just a symbol of luck, it was a gift for Mary, a sign that the debt had finally been paid in full. It was a petty human grudge that had fermented for 2 decades, turning a quiet man into a cold-blooded killer. Hamish sighed, the sound lost in the moan of the wind. He felt no triumph, only a weary sadness. Julian Van Smythe had been a loathsome creature, a predator who had returned to the scene of his crimes, but Peter had let the darkness of the past swallow his future. As the tall policeman turned to leave the cemetery, he saw a movement near the church wall. K-Man was standing there, a dark silhouette against the grey stone. He wasn't running, he wasn't hiding. He was just watching. The man shifted his weight, and even from the distance, Hamish could see the pronounced hitch in his walk. It was time for the trap to be set, not with handcuffs and shouting, but with a quiet conversation in the dark. Hamish knew he couldn't let Archie take the fall, but he also knew that DC Far's Blair would never understand the nuance of a 20-year-old heartbreak. He would have to handle this, the Lochdubh way. The mist was rolling in thick now, obscuring the village and turning the world into a realm of ghosts. Hamish adjusted his cap and began to walk toward the figure by the wall, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He wasn't the law in that moment, he was a neighbor, a witness to a tragedy that had finally reached its end. He knew that the confrontation would be quiet, as all things in the Highlands eventually were, settled between the silence of the mountains and the depth of the Loch. He just hoped that for once, he could find a way to balance the scales without losing another soul to the cold, grey earth. Lugs followed closely, his tail tucked low, sensing that the game had changed and the time for play was over. The truth was out, and in Lochdubh, the truth was often heavier than any stone. Hamish did not move to arrest the man by the wall. nor did he reach for the heavy iron handcuffs that sat in his pocket. Instead, he leaned against a neighboring headstone, the cold granite seeping through his jacket, and looked out toward the loch. The water was a flat, obsidian mirror, reflecting nothing but the void of the sky. "It is a strange thing about the Highlands, Peter," Hamish said, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. "Sound, and the water never forgets. Yet we humans think we can reinvent ourselves with a new suit and a posh accent." Jimmy Smith thought he could bury his past under a Zen garden and a bit of mustard tweed, but he didn't realize that some debts carry a lifetime of interest. Peter didn't move for a long time, his silhouette as rigid as the church itself. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. He laughed. "Hamish. When I went to him at the cottage to ask if he remembered the McRaes, he laughed. He said the girl was a fool, and her father was a bigger one. He didn't even recognize me. I was just the help, the man with the limp who carried his imported stone." Hamish sighed, the sound heavy with the weariness of a man who saw too much of the world's darkness. DC Fast Blair is a man of limited imagination, Peter. He wants a villain he can shout at, someone like Archie. He doesn't understand that a man might wait 20 years for a single moment of gravity, but he is coming back at dawn with a forensic team from Glasgow. They are bringing dogs that can smell a drop of oil on a mile of heather, and they are going to search every inch of this village. If they find the locket Jimmy took from Merith I with the white heather enamel, there will be no stopping them. Peter flinched then, a sharp, sudden movement. "The locket?" he whispered. "He had it." Hamish nodded slowly, though he knew the locket was a ghost, a piece of fiction he was weaving into the damp night air. "I saw it today, tucked into a crevice under the standing stone. I didn't tell Blair. I figured a piece of evidence like that deserved a proper home. I've put it in a brown envelope on my desk at the station. I'm going to the hotel now for a bit of supper. The station door is sticking, so I've left it on the latch. I'll deal with the paperwork in an hour." Without waiting for a reply, Hamish turned and began the long walk back toward the village, Lugs trotting faithfully at his heels. He didn't look back to see if Peter was following. He knew the bait was too sweet to ignore. For a man who had lived for revenge, the thought of Mary's stolen locket sitting in a police station was a lure more powerful than any threat of arrest. Hamish walked with a deliberate, slow-motion gait, stopping briefly at the post office to adjust his hat and again at the harbour to stare at the boats. He wanted to give the rumour time to settle, to let the weight of the evidence pull Peter toward the trap. As he entered the Lochdubh Hotel, the warmth of the lobby hit him like a physical blow, smelling of roasting lamb and floor wax. He spotted the manager, Mr. Johnson, and made sure to speak loudly enough for the kitchen staff to hear. "A terrible business, Mr. Johnson. I found a crucial bit of jewellery up at the cottage. It's sitting right on my desk. I'm just here for a quick sandwich before I take it through to Strathbane for the night." "Can't be too careful with Blair on the warpath." The manager nodded sympathetically, and Hamish retreated to a corner table, ordering a thick ham sandwich and a pot of coffee. He sat there for exactly 45 minutes, his eyes never leaving the clock on the wall. He ate slowly, savouring the mustard, though his stomach was tied in knots. He knew that by now, Peter would have slipped away from the churchyard. Hotel porter would know the back ways of Lochdubh better than anyone. The narrow alleys and the gaps in the stone walls, where a man with a limp could move like a shadow. Hamish paid his bill with a handful of loose change, tipped his hat to the barmaid, and stepped back out into the freezing drizzle. The village felt different, sharper, more expectant. The cosy glow of the cottages seemed to retreat, leaving the streets to the ghosts of Jimmy Smith's victims. Hamish didn't head straight for the station. He circled around the back, moving through the damp grass of the paddock behind his cottage, Lugs silent as a wolf beside him. He reached the rear window of the station and peered inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint rhythmic pulse of a street lamp outside. On the desk sat the brown envelope, weighted down by a heavy glass paperweight. It was empty, of course, but in the gloom, it looked substantial enough to contain a lifetime of secrets. Hamish moved to the side door, slipping inside with the practiced ease of a man who lived in the shadows he policed. He retreated into the small, cramped pantry, leaving the door cracked just enough to see the desk. He sat on a crate of confiscated cider, his hand resting on Lug's neck to keep the dog still. The wait began. In the silence, Hamish could hear the ticking of his own heart and the distant, mournful cry of a tawny owl in the woods. He thought about the Sassenach tension that had fueled Vainsmythe's arrival and the cold, calculated way the man had tried to strip the village of its dignity. He thought about Mary McRae, whose only crime had been believing in a boy's promises. Minutes stretched into an hour. The damp cold of the pantry began to bite into Hamish's bones, but he didn't move. She was a Highlander. He was used to waiting for the tide to turn or the mist to clear. Then he heard it. The faint, unmistakable scuff of a boot on the front step. The door creaked, the latch he had intentionally left loose giving way with a soft moan. A figure silhouetted against the street lamp entered the room, moving with a rhythmic, uneven gait. The limp was more pronounced now, a heavy dragging sound on the floorboards. The figure stopped at the desk, their breath coming in short, ragged gasps. A hand reached out, trembling in the pale light, and closed around the brown envelope. Hamish felt a pang of genuine sorrow. He didn't want this arrest. He didn't want the paperwork or the trial or the look of triumph that would surely be on Blair's face. But the law, as he had told Peter, was a blunt instrument, and the trap had finally snapped shut. He stood up, the pantry door swinging wide. "It's a long way to Strathbane in the rain, Peter," Hamish said, his voice soft but steady. "I think it's time we finished this." The figure in the dark froze, the envelope clutched to their chest like a holy relic. The trap was set, the killer was caught, and the quiet return to Lochdubh's peace was only a few hours away, though the cost of that peace was written in the lines of grief on Peter's face. Hamish stepped into the room, reaching for the light switch, knowing that the lazy policeman had once again seen what the experts had missed. The silence of the station was absolute, save for the sound of a man's world finally falling apart in the Highland night. The light switch clicked with a sound like a pistol shot in the small, crowded room, and suddenly the shadows were banished to the corners, replaced by the harsh, unflattering glare of the overhead bulb. Peter froze, his face a pale, sweating mask of terror and exhaustion. He looked smaller in the light, a ragged, limping figure whose life had been consumed by a singular, cold ambition. His fingers, trembling violently now, clawed at the brown envelope he held clutched to his chest. With a desperate, guttural sound, he ripped the flap open, his eyes darting back and forth between Hamish and the prize within. When his hand emerged with nothing but a blank sheet of stationery, the silence in the station became a heavy, suffocating thing. Peter stared at the paper as if it were a betrayal more profound than any Jimmy Smith had ever committed. He looked at Hamish, his eyes wide and brimming with a sudden wild light. "There is no locket," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "You lied to me. You used Mary's name to pull me into this trap." Hamish stood by the door, his long arms hanging loosely at his sides, but there was a tension in his frame that suggested a coiled spring. "I had to, Peter," Hamish said, his voice thick with a genuine regret that even Blair could not have faked. "The law doesn't care about 20-year-old heartbreaks, but it does care about dead men in Zen gardens. I couldn't let Archie McLean go to jail for a crime he didn't have the stomach for. You knew that. You counted on it." Peter's face contorted, the grief finally curdling into a sharp, jagged rage. He wasn't the invisible hotel porter anymore. He was a cornered animal, with the weight of a standing stone in his heart. "He deserved it," Peter screamed, the sound echoing off the sterile walls of the station. "He came back here to laugh at us. He stood on the very ground where Mary died and talked about mindfulness and peace. He stole our lives. Hamish, she stole everything, and the world gave him a mustard tweed jacket and a Range Rover in return. I didn't kill a man, I removed a cancer from the Highlands." As he spoke, Peter's hand drifted toward the desk, his fingers closing around the heavy glass paperweight Hamish used to keep his paperwork from blowing away in the draft. It was a solid, lethal chunk of crystal, and in the hands of a desperate man, it was more than enough to crack a skull. Hamish saw the movement, his hazel eyes tracking the shift in Peter's weight. He knew the limp would slow the man down, but adrenaline is a powerful equalizer, and Peter had enough of it to fuel a dozen men. Before Hamish could offer a word of calm, Peter lunged. It wasn't the graceful movement of a trained fighter, but a clumsy, violent surge of desperation. He swung the paperweight with a frantic strength, aiming for Hamish's temple. Hamish, however, was no longer the lazy policeman who sat by the loch. He moved with a startling, fluid speed that would have left the rugby players of Strathbane gaping in disbelief. He stepped inside the swing, his large, calloused hand snapping out to catch Peter's wrist in a grip of iron. The impact jolted through Hamish's arm, but he didn't flinch. He used his height and the leverage of his Highland-bred muscles to twist the man away, attempting to pin him against the wall without causing unnecessary harm. But Peter was beyond reason. He fought with a manic energy, his boots scuffing and kicking at Hamish's shins, his free hand clawing at the policeman's face. They crashed into the desk, sending the empty envelope and the blank paper fluttering into the air like wounded birds. The struggle was messy, loud and devoid of any dignity, tumbled over the swivel chair, which skittered across the floor and slammed into the radiator with a metallic clang. Lugs was on his feet now, barking a fierce, rhythmic warning, his hackles raised as he circled the fighting men. Hamish felt the sharp edge of the desk dig into his ribs, but he didn't let go of Peter's wrist. He could feel the man's pulse racing, a frantic drumming against his palm. "Give it up, Peter," Hamish grunted, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "It's over. Don't make it worse than it already is." But Peter was possessed by the ghosts of the Macrae family. He managed to hook his foot behind Hamish's heel, and for a moment, the tall policeman lost his balance. They hit the floor together with a bone-jarring thud, the scent of wet wool and floor wax filling Hamish's nostrils. The glass paperweight escaped Peter's grip and shattered against the base of the stove, sending shards of crystal skittering across the linoleum like diamonds in the dust. On the floor, the fight became a grueling test of endurance. Peter was smaller, but he was wiry and fueled by a lifetime of resentment. He tried to sink his teeth into Hamish's hand, but Hamish pulled back just in time, rolling the man over and using his weight to pin Peter's shoulders to the ground. Hamish felt a surge of the old strength, the heritage of generations of men who had hauled nets and moved stones across the rugged terrain of Sutherland. He wasn't just a policeman, he was a part of the land itself, and the land was finally reclaiming its own. He managed to get one of Peter's arms behind his back, the joint protesting with a dull click. "Enough!" Hamish roared, the sound of his voice finally cutting through Peter's hysteria. The man beneath him suddenly went limp, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had arrived. Peter began to sob, a deep, racking sound that seemed to come from his very soul. Hamish didn't let go immediately. He waited until the tremors slowed, his own heart pounding against his ribs. He reached for the handcuffs on his belt, the cold steel clicking into place around Peter's wrists, with a finality that seemed to echo through the empty village. He stood up slowly, his knees cracking, and offered a hand to the man he had just subdued. Peter didn't take it. He stayed on the floor, curled into a ball, weeping for Mary, for his father, and for the 20 years he had spent waiting for a justice that had turned out to be nothing but ashes. Hamish looked around his wrecked station, the overturned chair, the broken glass, the spilled ink that was slowly spreading across the floor like a dark, expanding shadow. He felt no pride in the arrest, only a profound, hollow sadness. He had caught the killer, but he had lost a neighbor. Outside, the rain continued to lash against the window, the Highland weather indifferent to the small, messy tragedy unfolding within. Hamish wiped a smear of blood from his cheek where Peter's fingernails had found their mark. He knew that Blair would arrive soon, loud and boastful, ready to take the credit for a case he had almost botched. Hamish would let him. He would hide his bruises and his cleverness, retreating back into the mask of the lazy policeman of Lochdubh. He reached down and patted Lugs, who was finally quiet, the dog's tail giving a single, tentative wag. The trap had been effective, the arrest had been made, and the boar was finally silent, but the peace of the village felt more fragile than ever. Hamish walked to the window and looked out at the dark, wet street. He had done his duty, but as he watched the first faint light of dawn begin to grey the eastern sky, he knew that some wounds were too deep for any law to heal. He was just a man who had seen the truth in a sprig of white heather, and now he would have to live with the consequences of that vision in the quiet, lonely hours that remained before the world woke up. The ink on the floor had finally reached the edge of the rug, staining the frayed wool a deep, indelible black. It was a fitting end to a day that had begun with a poached salmon and ended with a broken man. Hamish Macbeth, the smartest man in the room, felt only the cold, biting weight of the Highland mist as it prepared to swallow the day once more. He had protected Archie. He had solved the mystery, but he had discovered that the price of the truth was often higher than anyone was willing to pay. He sat down in his broken chair, waiting for the sirens to return, a lonely sentinel in the heart of the Highlands. The sirens grew louder, a piercing intrusion into the fragile morning stillness of Lochdubh, as the first grey fingers of dawn began to stroke the jagged peaks surrounding the village. Inside the station, Hamish Macbeth sat amongst the ruins of his tiny office, the air still heavy with the scent of fear and old dust. He looked down at his hands, which were slightly steadying now after the adrenaline had begun its slow retreat, and then at Peter, who sat huddled on the floor like a discarded coat. The broken glass glinted on the floorboards, a mockery of the expensive Zen garden that had started this entire tragedy. When the door finally swung open with a violent force that threatened to take it off its hinges, DC Farr stepped in, followed by a wake of shivering subordinates, and the familiar, aggressive stench of cheap cigarettes and official self-importance. Blair's face was a magnificent, mottled shade of purple, a hue that suggested the walk from the car had been an immense physical struggle. He stared at the scene, the overturned chair, the ink-stained rug, and the handcuffed hotel porter, with an expression of profound disbelief. "What in the name of all that is holy is going on here, Macbeth?" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. "I leave you for 5 hours to secure a crime scene, and I return to find you've turned the station into a wrestling ring. Who is this man? Why is he in cuffs? And why do you look like you've been dragged through a gorse bush backward?" Hamish didn't stand up. He allowed his shoulders to slump, and his eyes to take on a vacant luster, the classic mask of the Highland simpleton that had served him so well throughout his career. "Oh, DCI Blair, sir," Hamish began, his voice a slow, rhythmic drawl that seemed to vibrate with a deliberate lack of urgency. "It's been a most peculiar night, so it has. I was just sitting here, thinking about those brilliant points you made earlier, about the hydraulic jack and the local connections, and I realized you were absolutely right. Your intuition about the killer being someone close at hand, someone hiding in plain sight, it stayed with me, sir. It haunted me, if I'm being honest." He paused, letting the flattery sink into Blair's thick skull like rain into a peat bog. Blair's chest puffed out slightly, his anger momentarily stalled by the flattery. "Go on," Blair grumbled, though his tone was marginally less lethal. Hamish gestured vaguely toward Peter. "Well, sir, following your lead about the red clay on the jack, I started looking into who might have access to the old brickworks. And would you not know it, Peter here, the hotel porter you identified as a man of interest in your preliminary survey, showed up at my door. He was in a terrible state, sir. He said the pressure of your investigation was too much for him to bear. He said he saw the way you were closing the net around the village, and he knew it was only a matter of time before a mind like yours saw through his little charade." Peter looked up then, his eyes glazed with shock and exhaustion, but Hamish caught his gaze and gave a tiny, imperceptible shake of his head. He was giving Peter a way out of the limelight, and himself a way out of a promotion. "He came here to confess, sir," Hamish lied smoothly, his Highland lilt thickening as he leaned into the deception. "But then he got a bit agitated. Nerves, you see, and we had a bit of a tumble. I'm afraid I wasn't as quick as you would have been, and the furniture took the brunt of it. I was just about to call the station in Strathbane to tell them that DC5's masterful tactics had forced a surrender, but you arrived before I could even pick up the receiver. It's a remarkable piece of police work on your part, sir." Blair stood there for a long moment, the purple in his cheeks fading to a triumphant, self-satisfied pink. He looked at Peter, then at Hamish, then back at the confessed killer. Blair, cracking the Highland mystery, was clearly dancing behind his eyes like sugarplum fairies, adjusting his belt and attempting to look like a man who had planned the entire evening's events from his armchair. "I suppose my methods can be a bit overwhelming for the criminal element. It's all about the atmosphere of inevitability, Macbeth. You create the pressure, and eventually, the valve pops. It's a shame you made such a mess of the arrest, though. Typical rural clumsiness. You're lucky I was here to take charge of the situation before you lost him entirely." "Aye, sir, I'm a lucky man," Hamish agreed, his voice dripping with a humility that would have made a saint blush. "I don't know what the village would do without your guidance. I've written down a few of the details Peter mentioned about the old grudge and the Macrae girl, just to save you the trouble of the initial intake. But I'm sure you'll want to conduct the formal interview in Strathbane, where the real detectives are." He handed over a few crumpled scraps of paper, making sure to smear a bit of ink on the top one so it looked unprofessional. Blair snatched the papers, scanning them with a dismissive air. "Grudges, history, white heather. It's all very quaint, Macbeth, but it's the financial angle I'll be focusing on. The fraud, the debt, that's the real story. This Highland melodrama is just window dressing. Now, get this man into the car. I want to be back at headquarters before the morning shift starts. I'll have to write a detailed report on how I directed this operation." As the uniformed officers hauled Peter away, the porter looked back at Hamish one last time. There was no hatred in his eyes. Hamish watched them go, happy to remain in his quiet, beloved, misty Highland home forever. The last of the blue lights faded into the thickening Highland mist, leaving the village of Lochdubh to the silence of the dawn and the soft, insistent patter of a cold rain. Hamish Macbeth stood on the step of his small police station, the damp air cooling the heat of the struggle that still throbbed in his temples. He watched the grey light slowly reveal the familiar silhouettes of the whitewashed cottages, the harbour, and the looming mountains that hemmed them in. The intrusion of the modern world, with its orange Range Rovers, mindfulness retreats, and the brutal greed of the city, had been expelled. It had left behind a mess of broken glass and shattered lives. But the rhythm of the Highlands, ancient and indifferent, was already beginning to assert itself once more. Inside the station, the wreckage of the night waited. Hamish turned back, his boots crunching on the shards of the crystal paperweight. Lugs was already back in his corner, his chin resting on his paws, watching with a weary intelligence as Hamish began the slow, methodical process of restoring order. He picked up the overturned chair, smoothed the ink-stained rug, and swept the remnants of Peter's desperation into a dustpan. Every movement was a prayer of thanks for the fact that he was still here, that the promotion he so dreaded had once again been deflected into the grasping hands of DC Thas Blair. To the world outside, Hamish was a failure, a lazy, unkempt policeman who had let a superior officer take the credit for a major arrest. But to Hamish, this was the ultimate victory. He would not be transferred to the smog and noise of Glasgow. He would not be chained to a desk in a fluorescent-lit office. He would remain in his beloved Lochdubh, where the air smelled of peat and the sea, and where the most pressing concern was usually the price of wool or the quality of a neighbour's gossip. He spent the next hour working in a quiet, focused trance. He scrubbed the ink from the floor, though a faint, ghost-like stain remained, a permanent reminder of the night the past finally caught up with Jimmy Smith. He made a pot of coffee, the steam rising in fragrant curls that fought against the lingering scent of Peter's fear. As the clock on the wall struck 7, the village began to wake. The first plume of wood smoke drifted from the chimney of the post office, and the distant clatter of milk bottles echoed across the square. It was as if the murder had never happened, as if the boar and his mustard tweed had been nothing more than a fever dream, brought on by too much mountain air. Hamish stepped outside again, his uniform straightened and his cap set at its usual, slightly rakish angle. He walked down to the post office, where Mrs. Kennedy was already at her post, her eyes sharp and hungry for the details that the sirens had promised. She looked at Hamish, noting the small scratch on his cheek and the way he leaned against the counter with his usual deceptive languor. The morning news had already begun to filter through the village, and the version that Blair had provided, the one where he was the hero of the hour, was already being weighed and measured against what the locals knew of the man. So, it was Peter, Mrs. Kennedy said, her voice hushed with a mixture of shock and satisfaction, and all because of that McRae girl from 20 years ago. To think he carried that weight for so long, Hamish. It's a tragedy, so it is. And that DC Blair, I heard him shouting all the way from my bedroom. He seemed very pleased with himself, though I don't recall seeing him doing much more than standing in the street and looking important. Hamish accepted a digestive biscuit with a modest shrug, his face a mask of rural simplicity. Well, the DCI has a very powerful mind, Mrs. Kennedy. He sees things we locals might miss. It's a lucky thing he was here to take charge. I'm just happy the excitement is over. A man needs his peace after all. He left the post office and headed toward the harbour, passing Mr. Patel, who was busy erasing the unauthentic Korma complaint from his mental ledger. The curry shop owner nodded to Hamish, a silent acknowledgement that the balance of the universe had been restored. The orange Range Rover was gone, towed away by a police team from Strathbane, and the sanctuary for soulful stillness was once again just the old Macri cottage, a lonely heap of stone on the cliff that would eventually be reclaimed by the heather and the wind. The boar had left no lasting mark on Lochdubh, save for a few legal notices that would eventually be used to light fires in the local hearths. Hamish reached the pier and looked down at the water. The Andub was flowing strong, the rain feeding the mountain streams until the loch was a deep, churning green. He thought of the salmon he had poached the previous morning. It felt like a lifetime ago. He decided he would have a quiet lunch, perhaps sharing a bit of the fish with Lugs, and then he would sleep for a week. He felt the weight of the night lifting from his shoulders, replaced by the comforting, familiar boredom of a Highland afternoon. There would be no more sirens, no more shouting, and no more mustard tweed. He walked back to his station, his pace slow and rhythmic, the tall, lanky figure of the law returning to its natural state of repose. He saw Priscilla's car in the distance, but he didn't stop. There would be time for explanations later, over a proper dinner at the big house. But for now, he wanted only the company of his dog and the warmth of his own stove. He entered the cottage, closing the door on the rest of the world. He stoked the fire until the embers glowed a fierce, comforting red, and then he sat in his worn armchair, the silence of Lochdubh wrapping around him like a well-worn blanket. Lugs settled at his feet, the dog's breathing steady and deep. Hamish closed his eyes, listening to the rain on the roof. He was exactly where he wanted to be. The mystery was solved, the killer was in custody, and the bore was a memory that would soon be as thin as the Highland mist. He was PC Hamish Macbeth, the man who knew everything and said nothing, the guardian of a village that thrived on its secrets. He reached out and patted Lug's head, a small smile playing on his lips. The world might think him lazy, and Blair might think him a fool, but as the heat from the stove began to seep into his bones, Hamish knew the truth. He had his peace, he had his home, and he had his dignity. In the Highlands, that was more than enough. The day was young, the salmon was fresh, and the law was once again a quiet, unobtrusive presence in the jewel of the Highlands. He drifted into a light sleep, dreaming of nothing but the sound of the wind and the sight of the mountains, content in the knowledge that he had survived another storm. Lochdubh was safe, and for Hamish Macbeth, that was the only reward that ever truly mattered in the end. Silence was a gift he had earned through sweat and cunning. He looked at the empty brown envelope on the desk one last time before tossing it into the flames. The secrets of the McRaes were gone. He was home,